30 men, one wooden boat, no armor. They row across the North Sea, beach the ship, and immediately fight an army that outnumbers them. And they win. This is how the Vikings built warriors who physically could not be stopped. And it started on a farm. The farm that built killers. The Norse didn't have barracks or military academies like Rome. Here's what they had instead. Something better. Every Viking warrior grew up on a Scandinavian farm. And farming in medieval Scandinavia was brutal. Clearing rocks from frozen soil in January darkness. Chopping wood for hours. Hauling fish up cliffs. Rowing boats through fjords with currents that could flip you in a heartbeat. From about the age of 7, Norse boys worked. Not chores, work. This wasn't training, it was just life. But it built a base of physical capacity that started in childhood and never stopped. Archaeological analysis of Viking-age skeletons tells the story. Researchers examining Norse burial sites found robust bones and strong muscle attachment areas consistent with heavy, sustained physical loading from youth. These weren't gym bodies. These were bodies built by decades of relentless labor in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The diet was equally important. Most medieval Europeans lived on grain, bread, porridge, more bread. The Norse diet was radically different. Archaeology and isotope studies suggest many Norse communities ate relatively high protein, high-fat diets rich in fish, meat, and dairy alongside grain porridge and bread, especially in coastal areas. Salmon, cod, herring, seal, game meats, dairy, nuts. Basically what a modern sports nutritionist would design if you said, build me a warrior who needs to row all day and fight all night. They had skyer, a thick strained dairy product loaded with protein. They likely consumed whey and other dairy byproducts rather than wasting them. Modern bodybuilders pay good money for whey protein supplements. Norse dairying cultures were using the same stuff 1,000 years ago out of pure practicality. Skeletal studies suggest Viking-age Scandinavian men averaged around 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 9 inches, roughly similar to their Anglo-Saxon contemporaries, maybe slightly taller on average. When Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan encountered Norse traders on the Volga River in 921, he described them as tall as date palms. Almost certainly exaggeration, but it tells you something about the impression they made. They were powerfully built, well-fed, and physically imposing. But strong farm boys are one thing. Turning them into warriors who could cross an ocean and fight at the other end required something else entirely. The longship, history's most brutal gym. The longship wasn't just transportation. It was arguably the greatest endurance training device ever accidentally invented. A typical warship carried 25 to 30 men. Larger ships could hold 60 to 80. Each man had a long oar. When the wind died or you needed stealth, approaching a coastline, you rowed. Rowing a longship is nothing like rowing a boat on a lake. Each stroke requires legs, back, core, and arms working together, pulling through ocean water, not a calm river. Modern reconstructions like the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, a replica of the Skulderev II warship, found that rowing for hours was brutally demanding even for fit modern crews. The voyage reports emphasize just how tough sustained rowing was and how critical crew coordination became under exhausting conditions. Crews would row in shifts, but those shifts could last hours. And you didn't row in comfortable gym clothes. You rowed in wool and leather, sometimes soaking wet, often freezing, sitting on a wooden chest that held everything you owned. The distances are staggering. Norway to England, roughly 600 miles. Norway to Iceland, about 700. Iceland to Greenland, another 900. These voyages took days to weeks, depending on wind. When the sail couldn't do the work, arms did. It's reasonable to think that hours of daily rowing, week after week, voyage after voyage, produced cardiovascular fitness far beyond what most medieval populations ever developed. But the longship built something else too. Seamless teamwork under miserable conditions. 30 men rowing in synchronization, compensating when someone faltered. You pushed through pain because if you stopped, everyone suffered. Modern sports scientists call this shared suffering bonding. The Vikings just called it sailing. Weapons training, built by repetition. Here's where Norse training gets interesting, though not always in the ways popular culture claims. Some modern writers argue Vikings trained with heavier practice weapons, similar to a method the late Roman writer Vegetius explicitly describes. Whether the Norse independently adopted the same trick is plausible, but not well documented. We just don't have the primary sources to confirm it, so take that one with a grain of salt. What we do know is that axes and spears were the most common Viking weapons, not swords. The reason was economic. A good sword was enormously expensive. An axe was something every farm had already. You chopped wood with it, cleared land with it. Then when the call came, you brought it to war. But axes had real combat advantages too. Because an axe concentrates its weight in the head, momentum helps carry the blow. Many modern practitioners argue this makes repeated strikes less taxing than some sword techniques, even if Vikings didn't think about it in biomechanical terms. Viking combat also demanded versatility. Warriors carried spears, axes, and often a seax, a short fighting knife for when everything else was gone. The sagas consistently portray warriors switching weapons mid-fight. This kind of fluency only comes from years of practice. Wrestling mattered too. The sagas are full of wrestling matches. Glima, the traditional Norse wrestling style, likely has roots in the Viking Age, though its formal codification came later. Balance, leverage, fighting on the ground. Practical training for the moment your weapon's gone and you're in the mud. Now combine all of this. A warrior who's been rowing for a week, who can swing an axe for hours, who can wrestle if disarmed, and who's been doing this since he was a teenager. That's what stepped off the longship. But weapons and muscles don't matter if your formation collapses, and that's where the Vikings had a trick that drove their enemies absolutely insane. The shield wall, ancient energy management. Most medieval battles worked like a bar fight. Two mobs crash together. Everyone swings until they're exhausted. Whoever's standing wins. The Vikings looked at this and thought it was stupid. Their solution? The skjaldborg, the shield wall. While primarily a defensive formation, modern observers can't help noticing it also functioned as a kind of energy management system, even if the Norse didn't think of it in those terms. Warriors locked round shields together. The front rank fought, ranks behind rested and waited their turn. When a front rank warrior got tired, he stepped back. A fresh warrior stepped forward. Seamless rotation. Sounds simple. Try doing it while someone's trying to bury a sword in your face. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, the Viking shield wall held against Harold Godwinson's entire English army for hours. The English outnumbered the Norse and had caught them by surprise. Many Vikings had left their armor back with the ships, a long march away. They still held the line for hours. Viking round shields were roughly 30 to 36 inches in diameter, made of planked wood, usually linden or pine, light enough to hold for extended periods. When you weren't fighting, you could rest the shield's weight against your body. Your arm gets a break while you're still protected. The effect on opponents was demoralizing. Facing a shield wall that kept rotating fresh fighters in while you were exhausting yourself against the same unbreaking line must have been maddening. When a Viking stepped back from the front line, opponents may have assumed he was retreating. Then a fresh Norseman appeared, and the exhausted defender suddenly faced someone who hadn't swung a weapon in 10 minutes. Now, the Anglo-Saxons absolutely used shield walls too. Harold's army famously fought in one at Hastings weeks later, but a shield wall depends on the endurance of the men holding it. And after weeks on a longship, followed by years of the life we've been describing, the Norse had endurance to spare. The crew bond, forged by misery, shared suffering, creates unbreakable bonds. Viking war leaders understood this centuries before any psychologist put it in a textbook. A Viking ship crew wasn't random fighters. It was a tightly knit unit, often from the same village, the same family, sometimes brothers fighting shoulder to shoulder. They'd rowed across open ocean together, bailed freezing seawater together at 3 a.m., shared rations when food ran low, and divided plunder when things went right. The Old Norse word for a comrade who shared your enterprise was felagi, from felag, meaning a partnership where people lay their property together. The English word fellow comes directly from this. These men pooled their resources, their risk, and their fate. If the ship sank, everyone drowned. If the raid succeeded, everyone profited. This created unit cohesion that professional standing armies spent centuries trying to replicate. A Roman legionary trusted his formation because he'd been drilled until the maneuver was automatic. A Viking trusted his shield wall because the man next to him had saved his life in a storm 3 weeks ago. But the psychological conditioning went deeper than bonding. Reputation, what the Norse called your judgment or fame after death, was everything. The Havamal puts it bluntly: cattle die, kinsmen die, but the judgment on a dead man never dies. Based on what we know of Norse honor culture, a warrior who showed cowardice didn't just face personal shame. His family's reputation likely suffered too. Marriage prospects, social standing, the stain could linger. Conversely, dying well in battle was the highest achievement. Not just spiritually, Valhalla and all that, but practically. Modern exercise science supports the broader principle here. Research on central fatigue suggests that mental state strongly affects when the body gives up. Your brain can signal exhaustion well before your muscles have actually failed. Warriors with deep ideological commitment tend to push through discomfort that would stop others. We can't measure exactly how this worked in Viking brains, but the principle is well established. Cold, hunger, and the toughness dividend. Scandinavian winters are brutal. Temperatures well below zero. Darkness for 18 to 20 hours in northern regions. Viking-age Norse people didn't just survive, they worked through it. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending livestock, fishing through ice. This constant cold exposure likely had physiological effects. Modern research shows that repeated cold stress can trigger the body to increase brown fat production and improve cardiovascular regulation. Whether this applies directly to Viking-age populations, we can't prove, but people who live and work through brutal cold develop a resilience that people in milder climates don't. Then there was the intermittent scarcity that winters forced. The Norse typically ate 2 meals a day, dagverda and nattverda. During lean winters, portions shrank. This cyclical pattern of feast and scarcity would have built what modern nutritionists call metabolic flexibility. Whether the Norse experienced exactly this effect, we can't prove, but the conditions were right for it. The sagas also mention swimming as a valued skill. Grettir's saga and the Laxdæla saga feature warriors swimming in frigid water as demonstrations of strength, sometimes in clothing or with weapons. Whether this was systematic training or just necessity, we can't say. But warriors accustomed to cold water swimming would have developed cardiovascular resilience that transferred directly to combat endurance. Think about it. A warrior who could swim across a frigid fjord in his clothes could also fight for hours in a shield wall without his heart giving out. The cold water was the training. The battlefield was just the exam, medicine, and getting back in the fight. The Vikings weren't just brutes who ignored injuries. They had a medical tradition that was, by medieval standards, remarkably practical. Honey was applied to wounds, and modern studies show honey has genuine antibacterial properties. Yarrow has anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effects that modern science has confirmed. Wounds were washed and bandaged, which is more than many medieval European physicians recommended. There's a well-known saga passage where a woman feeds an injured warrior herb porridge, then smells the wound. If she could smell the herbs through the wound, she knew it was a gut wound, and likely fatal. Sagas blend realism with literary art, so we can't take every detail as documentation. But it looks like empirical reasoning in a medieval Norse context. Diagnostic triage, crude but rational. Wounded warriors were expected to contribute as they could. Light work, tool repair, rope making, watching livestock. A wounded man who lay around was a burden. A wounded man who did what he could was still contributing, and he healed faster. This is essentially what modern sports medicine calls active recovery, where gentle movement during healing produces better outcomes than complete rest. The Norse arrived at it through pure practicality, not theory. Why Vikings got deadlier with age. A Viking warrior typically began raiding in his late teens and could continue into his 40s. 2 decades of rowing, fighting, farming, and surviving conditions that would hospitalize modern humans. Their bodies would have been adapting in profound ways, hearts growing more efficient, bones remodeling under constant physical loading. These are changes modern exercise science documents in endurance athletes, and we can see their traces in the archaeological record. Dense, remodeled bone structure consistent with sustained physical stress for years. But the knowledge mattered as much as the body. An experienced warrior knew how to pace himself in a shield wall, knew when to push and when to conserve, understood currents, weather, terrain. None of this could be taught in a classroom. It was earned through years of cumulative experience. A Viking veteran in his 40s was more dangerous than a young warrior in his 20s. For the same reason, a 40-year-old marathon runner outperforms a 20-year-old with raw talent. Endurance compounds like interest. The young warrior had strength. The veteran had wisdom, technique, pacing, and a body that had been adapting to extreme stress for 2 decades. And the institutional knowledge was passed down relentlessly. Sons learned from fathers. Younger crew members learned from veterans. The sagas served as oral textbooks, encoding tactical knowledge and warrior ethics in stories memorized and retold generation after generation. When a veteran died, his knowledge didn't die with him. It lived on in the men he'd trained and the stories told about him. Why it all worked together. None of these elements worked in isolation. They formed an integrated system where each piece amplified every other piece. The farm built the physical base. The diet provided the raw materials. The longship built the cardiovascular engine and the team cohesion. The weapons training built combat-specific strength. The shield wall conserved energy and leveraged teamwork. The belief system provided the psychological edge. The harsh environment built resilience. The medical knowledge kept warriors in the fight, and decades of compounding made them deadlier with time. Remove any single element and the system weakens. A strong warrior without the longship conditioning would gas out on the approach. A well-conditioned crew without the shield wall would waste their endurance in chaotic individual combat. A brave warrior without the cultural bonds would break when things got desperate. The Norse didn't design this deliberately the way Rome designed its military machine. That's what makes it remarkable. It emerged organically from the specific pressures of Scandinavian life. Every challenge their environment threw at them became accidentally the perfect training stimulus. For roughly 300 years, from Lindisfarne in 793 to Stamford Bridge in 1066, this system produced warriors who terrorized the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. 30 men in a wooden boat, showing up on foreign shores and defeating forces that outnumbered them many times over. The Vikings didn't build warriors who couldn't be stopped. Their world did it for them. Every frozen winter, every ocean crossing, every fjord, every axe swing, every night sleeping on wet planks under the stars. It was unique, tightly adapted to their world. And when that world changed, the warriors it produced faded with it. If you learned something new today, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me which section surprised you the most. And if you want to see how the Viking shield wall actually compared to the Roman formations they never fought, that video is right here. Subscribe so you don't miss it.